morning, VRL. How are you today? Hey, my name is Brad Nelson, and I'm from Georgia, where it's just as hot as it is here. And in fact, I was hoping that was going to get a little reprieve, and I stepped off the plane and just got blasted with this wall of heat. But I am a speaker, a writer, and an Israel study trip leader. And one day, God willing, if the conflict comes to an end, we'll be leading a group of VRLers through the land of Israel, and hope that if God is moving in you to be a part of that, that would be something that you would join. But before we jump in and continue the series in the Sermon on the Mount, I just want to invite you to take a moment and just open yourself to God, and let's just invite the Holy Spirit to come have its way among us. Gracious Father, merciful Son, Holy Spirit, you don't need our permission, but we need to hear ourselves give you permission to run around inside our heads and hearts this morning, bringing to life these scriptures, connecting the dots with the things that are happening in our lives. God, I just pray that those of us who need your comfort would experience your comfort and your presence. Those of us who need a loving kick in the pants, God, we ask that your Spirit would be faithful to do that. Would you be ruthless against anything in us that is less than the life you mean for us? Give us eyes to see you, ears to hear you, and feet to follow you. In the strong, resurrected name of your Son, Jesus, we all prayed. Amen. So the year is 2007. I have been married at this point to my bride, Trisha, for 5 years. And we are 6 months into this experiment called our first child. Nothing, it turns out, will reveal your level of actual maturity or lack thereof like your first child. It's just stressful. There's all this new stuff going on. And one of the things I learned is that it is not a good look for a 25-year-old man to be complaining all the time, when am I going to get to do what I want to do? But such is the life of a new parent. And so 6 months in, I said to my wife one day, listen, you have been momming it up so hard. You have been going hard as a mom. Why don't you take this Saturday and just go spend the day with your girlfriends? Just go, relax, enjoy, and have fun. And she did not need to be told a second time. Right? She got on the horn immediately and had it planned. And I'm just gonna say, she pushed it. She was out until 6:30, 7 o'clock. She amazingly timed it so that the baby was in bed by the time she walked through the door. Now, I was trying to really do something kind for her. So while she's gone, I got the baby, I'm doing all the dad stuff, I'm sweeping the floors, mopping the floors, doing the dishes, doing the laundry, folding the laundry, putting away folded laundry. I mean, I went over the top, you guys. And I timed it just so that when she walked through the door, dinner was on the table and a candle was lit. Now, it was a frozen pizza, okay? So don't think too highly of me. We were 25 years old, we were on a budget. But I did all these things. And then she came home and walked through the door and didn't notice a single one of them. She walks over to the table, she sits down and she starts eating pizza. And I'm just sitting there kind of awkwardly like looking around, kind of trying to guide her perception towards all of these wonderful things that I had done. Nothing. Then she finishes her second piece of pizza. She stands up from the table, the sheer audacity of it, walks out of the room without saying anything. And my blood is starting to boil. And then she pops her head in from the hallway, and I think to myself, oh, here it comes. She's just messing with me. She saw all this stuff that I did. And she pops her head in and she says, hey, when you're done, would you be sure to put the pizza away? Oh, guys, I lost it. And in that moment, I had to wrestle with the fact that I wasn't actually giving my wife a gift. I was making a bid for recognition. How many of you know exactly what I'm talking about? You have this motivation to do something kind, something good for someone else, but when you don't get the attaboy, when you don't get the pat on the back, when you don't get the slow clap husband of the year, your blood boils. Now, here's what's interesting. That instinct to be recognized, we all just want a little attention. That instinct to be recognized, to be seen, to have what we've done acknowledged, that is so deeply human, and it's actually something that's really good. It's evidence of who we are and why we're here. And one of the scandalous claims that the Bible is going to make over and over and over again is that you were made to be seen. In fact, the Bible is going to go on to say that the world will actually see God by seeing you. So in Genesis 1 and 2, God creates the world and says he made man and woman in his image. And friends, what that means is if you have breath in your lungs, then you reflect God's goodness and glory in the world in a way that nothing else in all of creation does. And when you are you, in the way that only you uniquely can be, with your particular gifts, skills, abilities, and ways, people see God when they see that. Jesus tells his disciples in the Sermon on the Mount, you're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the world. Paul, later in his epistles, is going to tell followers of Jesus that you are ambassadors for Christ, that God is making his appeal to the world through you. And so as you do good, you are meant to be seen doing that good. But here's the catch. How you go about being seen and the posture of heart that you have in the process makes all the difference. And this is what Jesus is going to address now in Matthew chapter 6. So let's read Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, where Jesus says this, watch out. Don't do your good deeds publicly to be admired by others, for you will lose the reward from your Father in heaven. When you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity, their frozen pizzas. I tell you the truth, they have received all their reward in full, all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. Now in Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, Jesus is going to talk about three things. In the 4 verses we read just now, he talks about the first, and that is almsgiving or giving to the poor. And this was a central part of the Judaism of the first century. In fact, after the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD and there was no more sacrificial system, the way you made atonement was by giving to the poor. So this was huge. But then after Jesus talks about giving to the poor in Matthew 6, he's going to talk about prayer. And after he talks about prayer, he's going to talk about fasting. And the reason that those three things are significant is that if you were a religious person in the first century, those were the core of your personal devotion to God. All you had to do was watch somebody's life, and if you could see these practices, you would know, this person is a follower of God. Now, what's interesting is that practices or disciplines are activities that are designed to reorient your heart. And so giving to the poor, giving to those who are needy, who are under-resourced, who are on the margins, who don't have power, as you give, as you form relationship, as you invest in those people, what happens is your heart starts to shift towards them. As human beings, we just have this tendency of beginning to fall in love with the things that we invest in. Years ago, my wife and I planted a garden, and I hate tomatoes. I can't stand them. I've never liked them. I still don't. I'm 43 years old. But we had so many tomatoes out of this garden, and they were not lovely to look at. In fact, if I had seen this particular group of tomatoes at the supermarket, I would have turned my nose up and wondered who's running this place that they would sell these. But here's the thing. I had sweat. I had bled. I had weeded. I had watered for months. And doggone it, I was not giving up on these things. When you give to the poor, it shifts your heart. It reorients your heart towards other people. Prayer, for so many of us, we got it in our head that prayer is how I get God to do what I want God to do. But that is not what prayer is. Prayer is where you and I join Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane and we pray, your will, not mine. Prayer is about being properly formed. Prayer is the place where we try to get ourselves to do what God wants to do. And so prayer as a practice, it reorients your heart towards God. Fasting. We are physical bodily creatures who require calories to get through the day. I hiked Diller Creek yesterday. I was very aware of my need for calories going up this steep incline at 90 degrees. And most of us here in the West, when we're hungry, we can just go to the pantry or we can stand in front of the fridge and we eat. We fill ourselves. But here's the thing. If you follow Jesus, then what you have confessed is that there's other food I need other than bread in order to survive. I need every word that comes from God's mouth. In other words, I am not an independent being who can just provide for myself what I need. I am dependent on God, and sometimes I deprive myself of food to cause my body to remember that fact. And fasting reorients your heart towards your own self. I'm not independent, I'm dependent. And so all of these practices are designed to shift and change your heart. And Jesus begins by saying, when you give to the poor. And that's pretty crucial to catch. He says, when you give to the poor, not if you give to the poor. Not if your church is doing something in the city and you feel so compelled. When? Jesus assumes that his followers are going to be engaged in a life of practice. Now, this is an author named Daniel Coyle. He wrote a book in 2008 called The Talent Code. Greatness isn't born, it's grown. Here's how. And Daniel Coyle wrote this book because he had been traveling all over the world to what he called talent hotspots. Picture a tiny rural village in Russia or a poor favela in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and it's kind of rural, small population, but these strange out-of-the-way places just kept churning out world-class athletes. Russian gymnasts, figure skaters, incredible soccer players, and he wanted to know, what is it about these little talent hotbeds that so consistently produces such greatness? So he started traveling to them, and he said, one of the things I was expecting to find was I guess there's just a weird, superior genetic pool in the middle of nowhere in Russia, or in the middle of nowhere in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And he said, that is not what I discovered. What I discovered when I went to these places was little soccer players trying to master a move and tripping over the ball. Gymnasts trying to stick their landing and falling down. And they would intentionally operate right at the edge of their ability, right at the edge of failure, and they often failed. And he said then they would do this thing where after they screwed up, they would stop, they would slow down, they would focus. They would get this look on their face, and then they would do it again. And they did this over and over until suddenly there was a shift, and what had been new suddenly went from being normal to being second nature. And he called these places communities of deep practice. And the idea behind practice is that struggle stimulates growth. And he illustrates this in this book with this quiz. Now, there's a column A, a column B, and both columns have words that are related to each other. And obviously, column B has a letter missing. Now, what's interesting is if I took column B away and gave you 30 seconds to memorize column A, and then I took column A away and gave you 30 seconds to try and memorize column B, and then I quizzed you, which one do you think you would remember with greater accuracy? Over and over again, column B, by a long shot. It's not even close. Why? Because when your brain sees that blank, you stop, you slow down, and you focus. And because you do that, it gets in you at a deeper level. And that is the idea of a community of practice. And before we even touch giving to the poor in order to be seen, we just got to stop and acknowledge that Jesus expects those of us who follow him are going to be engaged in a life of deep practice. See, the Sermon on the Mount is not just abstract spiritual thinking. Jesus has this revolutionary message that heaven is invading earth and that there's a community of people called disciples who are the front wave of that invasion. And how they live will be how the world sees God and experiences the government of God coming to be in the world. And so Jesus isn't interested in making you a better version of yourself. Jesus is interested in making you an entirely new person, a person like himself. And friends, we only get there through deep practice. And so before we even look at this, we just need to stop and ask ourselves, are you practicing? Are you practicing your following of Jesus? And is it shifting anything in your life? Now, the Sermon on the Mount has this brilliant structure, and we don't have time to go into the depths and intricacies of it. So I just want to give you kind of like an overview so you can see the brilliant thing that Matthew is doing. If you think back to high school when you wrote papers, or maybe in college, you would structure a paper this way: the intro, the body, and the conclusion. Tell them what you're going to tell them, tell them what you told them, right? Pretty simple and straightforward. And that's exactly how Matthew structures the Sermon on the Mount. And so the intro to the sermon is the Beatitudes, and Jesus is simply just going to talk about the good life. The good life is available to anyone and everyone, even if you're poor, even if you're mourning, even if you're meek, even if you're persecuted. It's not that Jesus is trying to get us to become poor or brokenhearted. He's saying, if you are, you're not beyond the reach of my kingdom. The good life is available even to you in the place that you're at. Then he's going to launch into the main section of the Sermon on the Mount. And believe it or not, the Sermon on the Mount is primarily concerned with righteousness. And we'll talk about that word in a moment. And then he's going to finish with a couple of passages about practice. In fact, if you had to sum up the Sermon on the Mount in like a single phrase, it would be something like this: the good life's available. Here's how. Now go practice it. Go do it. But Jesus devotes this whole center section to this idea of righteousness. Now, righteousness is one of those very Christian-y, churchy sounding words that maybe we kind of know what it means, but we've sort of lost the power and explosive nature of it. So in Greek, it's the word dikaiosune, but in Hebrew, it's the word tzedakah. Let me hear you say tzedakah. Tzedakah, yes. And that Hebrew is really the backbone of the concept of righteousness. And so yes, righteousness does mean right behavior, but in Hebrew, it means the standard of right relationships. So when God created the world, he created 4 primary relationships: relationship with God, relationship between humans, relationship between humans and their own selves, and relationship between humans and creation. Righteousness is when you are in right relationship in all of those dimensions. In fact, I read a text this morning as I was just kind of spending some time in the Word in Psalm 85:13. It's the last verse in Psalm 85 that just says, righteousness will go before the Lord. It will prepare a way for him. Friends, what that means is when you get your relationships in your life sorted out and you're in right relationship, your life becomes a portal making a way for God to come into the world. So righteousness is critical. But righteousness was a word that was deeply associated primarily with the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. They were scrupulous in doing all the things, keeping all the rules. And what Jesus is going to do as he talks about righteousness in the Sermon on the Mount is he's going to start by pointing to the conventional righteousness of the teachers of the law and the Pharisees. But then he's going to go on to point out how their approach to righteousness breaks down and gets caught in this vicious cycle. It's like a surface level righteousness that doesn't actually change the heart. So he's going to say things like, you've heard that it was said, don't murder. Or you've heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And then he's going to go on to point out things like this. You think you're righteous just because you haven't murdered anyone? We all know that you assassinate people with your words. We all know that you backstab. We all know that you gossip. And yet you're going to stand there and hold your head high thinking that you're righteous because you haven't killed anybody. Let's not play that game. Oh, you think you're righteous because you haven't slept with her? But where did your eyes go? Where did your heart go? And where did your mind go? And Jesus is going to keep pointing out how this approach to righteousness gets caught in this very vicious, hypocritical cycle. And then he's going to take it a step further and say, if you follow me and you're a part of this community of practice and you want to be transformed, here's how you do it. Practice your righteousness this way and it will change your heart. So we should anticipate that Jesus is going to follow this same pattern as he talks about giving to the poor. Now, one last interesting bit. For the last 3 weeks, you guys have moved through Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 48. And that's where Jesus is talking about bad things that get in the way of life with God. Anger, lust, vengeance, breaking oaths. But now in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus is going to shift gears and he's going to talk about good things that get in the way of life with God. How many of you know good things can sometimes become a barrier between you and life with God? And so Jesus launches in and he says, when you give to the poor, don't announce it with trumpets. Now, in the first century, a trumpet was something totally different, not like what we think of today when we have trumpets. And I had a shofar that I was going to bring, but I didn't want to have an awkward moment with TSA, like, why are you carrying this? We're taking your ram's horn. So what I want to do is I just want to show you a picture or a short video of my 8-year-old daughter playing the ram's horn that I brought home from Israel. Go. The dog hated this thing. It gets better. She's gonna find her groove. And so the shofar, yes, there we go. Charlotte, I told her on the phone, I said, baby, I showed your video on Thursday night at VRL and they just loved it, honey. And she ate that up because we all just want to be seen. But so the shofar, Jesus says, don't blow the shofar. Don't sound the trumpet before you do your good deed. Now, what's interesting is we know from the Mishnah, which is a document that was finalized in 200 AD, but it had been compiled hundreds of years before then. The Mishnah tells us that there were 13 giving boxes in the temple shaped like a shofar. And the idea was that as you made your contribution, it would amplify the sound. So if you're a wealthy person and you're dropping a lot of coins in there, it gets louder and louder, and it keeps going. And what happens is people start to look over and they're like, wow, who is that? Wow, that guy's really, wow, they're really getting after it over there. Now, Jesus is not in Jerusalem when he's giving the Sermon on the Mount. He's in Galilee. So I don't know that he's necessarily talking about that, but it's probably in the back of some people's minds. More likely, what Jesus is just pointing out, he's just using this language to point out when people do the right thing for the wrong motivation. When people do the right thing for the wrong motivation. Now, do we have any Seinfeld fans in the room? I love the way that the writers of Seinfeld could hone in to these everyday experiences of life and have so much fun with them. And in a lot of ways, point out the hypocrisy of these little kind of things that happen in life. And so one of the writers of Seinfeld, a guy by the name of Larry David, went on to have his own show called Curb Your Enthusiasm. And he had an episode entirely devoted to our hypocrisy around giving. And so I want to show you just a short clip called The Anonymous Donor.
Hey. Larry David.
Huh?
That's great.
Never had a wing before.
I know.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
It's your night to shine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. What is that? Wing donated by Anonymous.
Yeah.
Anonymous?
Yeah.
I'm not crazy about that. Now it just looks like I did mine for the credit. As opposed to, Mr. Wonderful Anonymous.
I know who it is. It's Ted. Ted is anonymous.
What are you, kidding?
No. Isn't that great? He donated the whole wing. Didn't want anybody to know.
Well, he told you, so he apparently wanted somebody to know.
He told me, okay?
Who else did he tell? How do you know he just told you?
No. The point is that he didn't need all the fanfare and didn't need
Fanfare? What fanfare? I don't like the fanfare. Are you saying I like fanfare?
You can tell a few people. He just doesn't need the whole world to know that he donated all this money.
You know what? I didn't need the world to know either. Nobody told me that I could be anonymous and tell people. I would have taken that option, okay? You can't have it halfway. You're either anonymous or you're not. What is it?
Look, people are pointing out and go, there's Larry David.
Oh, yeah, there's Larry David, the guy who has to have his name up on the wall, as opposed to Mr. Anonymous, but was really Ted.
I'm proud of you.
Nobody told me I could be anonymous and tell people. I would have taken that option. And he gets more and more amped because the episode goes on. He keeps running into people who are like, did you know that this anonymous person was Ted? And so we do things, but we do them with the wrong motivation. Now, this passage in Matthew 6 has led so many followers of Jesus over the years based on the words, when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private. And so there are so many followers of Jesus who've just kind of taken this as a rule of thumb, like, I need to do my stuff in secret so nobody sees it. But if you go back into the sermon, Jesus in Matthew 5 says, no one after lighting a lamp puts it under a bushel basket. So do your good deeds so that your light will shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to God. And you say, well, Jesus, which is it? Which is it? And what Jesus is getting at in this text is that it's not about attention. It's about intention. It's about the posture of your heart as you seek to do good. And he's going to keep using a word over and over when he talks about giving to the poor, when he talks about prayer, when he talks about fasting, he's going to use this Greek word hypokrites. Now, when you hear hypokrites, what do you hear? Hypocrite. Now, that word didn't mean the same thing in Jesus' world as it does ours. In the first century, a hypocrite was an actor, somebody who was on a stage and who played a role to the crowd. And first century actors wore masks. Now, Jesus is the one who gives us the way we think of hypocrite today. He is responsible for that by saying, like, a hypocrite is somebody who projects one reality to the crowd seeking their approval and their applause, when in fact, the truth behind the mask is very different. And he's going to call the religious leaders and Pharisees, teachers of the law, hypocrites. And in Matthew 23, he uncorks on them and says they do all their deeds to what? To be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad. Bonus points if you can fit that word into conversation this week. Their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honor at banquets, the best seats in the synagogues, and to be greeted with respect in the marketplace, and to have people call them rabbi. Now, what is a phylactery? What is a fringe? So if you come with me to Israel, when we get to Jerusalem, you will see something like this. You see the box off the front of the head there. That is a phylactery. And so in the Shema, in Deuteronomy 6, God tells the people of Israel, I want you to bind my words on your forehead. So they took that literally. They would take little prayer scrolls and write out prayers and write out pieces of the Torah and wear them on their head when they prayed. In Numbers 15, God tells them, I want you to have fringes on the corners of your garments. And you can see the fringes hanging off the corners there. And they were symbolic of the Old Testament commandments. So every time you saw the fringe, you were to be reminded, I am here to live out God's commandments. Now, what had been happening is that they were observing these commandments, but it had turned into who can have the biggest phylactery. Picture like a birthday present hanging off the front of somebody's forehead. I mean, I just picture like, oh my gosh, Becky, did you see his phylactery? It was so big. Wedding train length fringes. And if that strikes you as ridiculous, when was the last time you went to a rodeo? So here's the thing. We do this kind of stuff all the time. We play to the crowd. We project one reality with our doing good when in fact there's something else lurking behind it. Now I want to show you a short clip of a comedian. The clip is called The Honest Mission Trip Leader. And I just want you to remember the way that comedy, often in biting fashion, points out what's true that we don't care to admit.
Day 4, you guys, is when we really get down to business. We're gonna paint a school. Are there skilled painters in that country that could probably do a better job than us? Yes, there are. Does this country have high unemployment and they could probably use the work? Again, also true. Was this school painted last week by the mission team that came before us? Again, yes. But that's not important, okay? We're gonna paint the school and we're gonna get some photos to send back to the church. I swear, if one more person loses their passport. Listen, guys, I understand things are gonna be difficult. We're gonna get tired, but we must never waver from our goal to get photos with minority children for our Facebook profiles.
That stings. It stings because it hits too close to home. It stings because in so many ways it's so painfully true. Now, we've already articulated that Jesus has no problem with us doing our good to be seen. Right now, this church has mission teams out in the world doing good, and it is right and good and appropriate that we would celebrate them and recognize them. But Jesus says to his community of practice, beware, be very careful about how you do your good so that you don't end up turning the spotlight off of the good thing and onto yourself and telling a different story. Look at how great I am. Look at how much I'm helping the world. Look at how happy the world is that I'm so faithful. Now that comedian, John Chris, is a follower of Jesus, and he had a moral failure a couple of years ago. And I watched an interview that he did as I was prepping for this teaching. And one of the things that he had to process as he owned his sin in public was that I had projected one reality to the crowd when in truth my heart was very different and I was addicted to attention. And what the internet does and what social media does is it puts the crowd in your pocket. And so we end up with things like this. The builders are almost finished with our 4,500 square foot house. We should be able to move in the next couple of weeks. The granite countertops look incredible with the ebony cabinets, and the kids love the waterfall pool. My personal favorite, though, the movie room, to God be the glory. Any of you think that that post is actually about God's glory? And so what we do is we curate and project an image that doesn't actually match the truth behind the mask. And what happens is that selfie after selfie, what we're really saying is, would somebody just please look at me? Would somebody please see me? And what starts out as a request turns into a flex. Did you see where I was? Do you see what I have? Do you see who I was with? And it gets dark and it gets nasty. We live at a moment in human history where the narrative is this: my worth is determined by how I am perceived by others. And Jesus says that is a lie from the pit of hell. Do not live for the approval of others. Do not play and project a role for the crowd, because brothers and sisters, the crowd is fickle. 1 minute the crowd loves you, the next minute they forget your name. 1 minute they love you, the next minute they want to know, what have you done for me lately? Wait, hasn't it been like 3 years since you won a championship? Why are you still our coach? Make one false move, one mistake in public, and the crowd will be done with you. They will cancel you and move on. But do you know who won't? Your Father in heaven. His memory is long. His eyes have been on you from the very beginning. In fact, he was looking at you like this while you were still in your mother's womb. Somewhere in heaven, God has a cardboard box with every trophy you've ever won, every participation ribbon you ever got for any spelling bee you've been a part of. And sometimes I think that God passes his time going through the box and marveling and glorying in all of the good that you and I did in secret that nobody else saw. And your Father in heaven sees you like this, and in a culture like ours, Jesus says, as you do your good, choose your audience wisely. Because if what you're after is likes, shares, and followers, then you have received your reward in full. But there is a better way. There is a better reward. A couple years ago, I came home from work, and Charlotte had spent all afternoon building this little tower out of Legos. And it was a big deal when Daddy got home. And so she comes tearing into the kitchen to meet me. And the reason I remember this story and show you this picture is because she kept saying this phrase over and over and over. And the phrase was, Daddy, look. Daddy, look what I did. She didn't care who saw. She wanted one person to see. She had done this for an audience of one. Daddy, look. And so as you walk out of here, called as a disciple of Jesus to a life of practice, to do good and be seen by the world, do it for your Father in heaven. Would you stand with me? And I want to invite you to take a posture of openness to receive these words as a blessing and a benediction as you go. Brothers and sisters, your reward for doing good, for caring for the poor, isn't a mansion in the clouds when you die. Your reward is to know this kind of love, the kind of love that sees you, that never tires of delighting or glorying in you. And it's this kind of love that gives us the confidence to become the new kind of people Jesus means for us to be. Your life, your choices are the front edge of God's invasion of earth. Do it for your Father in heaven.